Thank you very much. Mein Deutsch ist sehr schlecht, so I'm going to speak to you in English. I'm a little worried that you have to stand, but well. So what I would like to do is talk for about an hour, and then we talk. Is that it? And take questions and so on. Okay. I am finishing a project on material culture, and I've written 2 books so far on it. One is about Handwerk, about craftsmanship, and the other is about social relations imagined as a craft, which is my book, which is translated here oddly, Zusammen. I don't know why, but and the final book that I'm doing in this is about the craft of urban design. And this is at once a very old and a very new subject for me. I started out writing about cities longer ago than I wanted to think about, and haven't done so for about the last 15 years. And coming back to this subject of urban design now, at the end of my writing life, I have become interested in new ways of practicing the craft of urban design, ways I won't pursue, but perhaps you will. And what I'm going to try to explain to you tonight is one of these ways, which is the application of open systems theory and open systems thinking to the practice of urban design. As a general overview to this, I want to say that in my view, the problems with the modern city, with the design of the modern city, aren't simply a failure of technical means, but from a very narrow conception of the city as a closed system, a system in equilibrium, a system basically in harmony, where the parts are in harmony, a system where there's a tight relation between form and function. And that closed system, I argue, is a way of killing off the creative work of design. And I want to propose in its stead what we could learn about a more open system of design, more informal, more anarchic, more incomplete, more alive than the forms of design that we think about at the present time. As I say, this is a sort of glimpse I had now at the end of my life. I wish I'd had it 30 years ago, but that's the way things work out. But I hope that this argument for a more open system is one that inspires you to do work in this way. I guess the first place to start here is to talk a little about the difference between open and closed systems. And in a way, this difference is very concrete. In the lab, scientific lab, for instance, performing an experiment to prove or disprove a hypothesis means we're working within the framework of a closed system. The original proposition governs our procedures and observations in arriving at yes or no, testing a hypothesis. When in performing an experiment, we come across something unforeseen or are prompted. Do I have to press this? That's all I have to do. Here we are. Nothing. When in performing an experiment, we come across something unforeseen or are prompted by evidence to jump tracks and think about a different issue, then we are working in the framework of an open system. We move beyond yes or no to exploring something new to our own understanding. This same contrast operates in the craftsman's studio. A potter performs a series of routines to sift and homogenize clay in order that it fire evenly in the kiln. She knows what works and what doesn't work. She's in control of the system. But then something unforeseen in the composition of clay coming from a new source may cause it to fire unevenly, no matter that she did everything right. There is a flaw, but it has something more interesting in texture than those of her old pots, which suggests that she needs to rethink her practices of refining clay. And now she is in the open orbit. So that's the basic contrast I want to draw. I want to make it a little more technical, and this is quite condensed, so I'll read it slowly. I could even read it 2 times, which is what do we mean technically by an open and closed system? The concept of an open system was first made explicit by Norbert Wiener, who is the guru of cybernetics, science of information flows and feedbacks, on which modern computing relies. But the idea of an open system is much older. It appeared, I think, in the idea of evolution, as first propounded by Charles Darwin and then deepened by Gregor Mendel. Darwin observed that environments change in form over time. Mendel explained the genetic changes in organisms which allow them to evolve, which is that in place of a predictable plan conceived by a master, the environment is an unstable process in which chance mutation plays its role. This is the essence of an open system, mutating in ways which are going out of control. In general, systems analysts use 5 principles to draw contrasts between open and closed. First, the parts in the open system which interact have a distinctive character. You cannot simply substitute one element for another. Then, simple rules can generate complex results, which is the phenomenon called emergence. 2 simple rules, they interact, and something more complex results. That's emergence. Next, known and determinate beginnings can wind up producing unforeseen or unpredictable results, which is the special meaning of chaos in a complex system. That is, that you start with something you understand, and its interactions produce something that are unpredictable occurring, which is what chaos means to systems analysts. We can also think less dramatically of events which have latent consequences, something you didn't foresee. Fourth, in a complex system, a relatively small-scale event can trigger a massive change in the whole system. And this trigger is what we call in everyday language a tipping point. It's famously embodied in the flapping wings of a butterfly, which through a chain of events set off a storm halfway across the world. And the chain by which those events are magnified are conceived as tipping points. That's, of course, at an extreme. More normal are the changes which occur via path dependencies, a sequence of events changing course from its original as a sequence of influences appear in its path. And finally, surprisingly, complex systems can self-organize, analyzing emergent conditions, responding to tipping points, adapting to chaos. And this self-organization is called autopoiesis. In general, these systems, you can understand, are therefore called nonlinear. They're not this. They're this. Open systems are sometimes called in some, as I say, nonlinear systems. Okay. I said that too. Now, here's the contrast to a closed system. A closed system contrasts to each of these 5 features. Mathematically, the system possesses 2 characteristics: additivity, which means that the parts always add up to a clear sum. If you put everything together, you have a clear result. And homogeneity, which means in systems theory that the parts are directly interchangeable. 2 plus 2 equals 4, not 3 plus something or other. There is no phenomenon of emergence because the system is binary and reductive. Yes, no rules, which is to say mathematically that Boolean logic governs a closed system. This is a system you all learned in school to do quadratic equations, for instance. There are tipping points in a closed system, but they never come as a surprise. They can always be calculated in advance. Additivity and homogeneity mean further that there is no chaos in the technical sense. You can produce complex structures by progressively, linearly combining simple, interchangeable elements. This is the linear character of a closed system. And finally, instead of autopoiesis, you have a different kind of self-analysis in a closed system, one ruled by equilibrium. The system treats as noise the feedback of information which does not serve harmony and balance. And this is why closed systems are thought of as static or homeostatic, and open systems as dynamic. Now, I presented this to you in a fairly technical way. Let me say that if you're a reader of Nietzsche, you know this distinction between open and closed. It's the distinction between Dionysian and Apollonian, as Nietzsche writes about it in The Birth of Tragedy. Dionysius is open, closed system of balance and harmony is Apollonian. With this Nietzschean distinction in mind, we can make further sense, not entirely frivolous, of some aspects of the term nonlinear. Nietzsche tells us that Silenus, his Dionysian god of excess, had lost his memory, unable to recall whenever he began drinking, about all the hangovers and vomiting which had come to him before this drinking session. These are memoryless events, and that exists in the dry realms of systems theory as well. like flipping a coin. The mathematician Georgy Markov, who was also an addicted gambler, spent a lifetime pondering this memoryless event, puzzling over what patterns the endless flipping of coins might produce. If there were none, he wrote, then as an addicted gambler, he was in the grip of absolute meaninglessness. Nietzsche's tropes of disappearance and disintegration, the waste produced by the avid pursuit of sexual and pleasure, other kinds of pleasure, are markings of Dionysian time, a time of emotional eruption and entropy. Dionysian time appears in the dry realm of open systems theory in the phenomenon of aperiodic fluctuations, that is, patterns which do not repeat after a certain period, or of amplitude death, such as a pendulum gradually succumbing to gravity. To the novelist, there would be nothing odd about the idea of an open system. It is the very essence of narrative. If after the first paragraph or two of a novel you could predict how it would end, you wouldn't bother to read it. What keeps you involved are uncertainty, surprise, and the ever-revised understanding the characters have of themselves and each other. A bad novel is linear. A good novel is non-linear. Now, so what I've laid out to you in the first part of this lecture are just some tools for thinking about open and closed systems. Now, I'm going to show you just bits of skimming about how I apply this distinction between open and closed systems to design, okay? And if I can make this work, I'm going to start with some features of closed systems in urban design. The first of them is overdetermined form. That is a form which is absolutely defined and fixed, as in the plan voisin of Corbusier for Paris. You know this image? Good. And the system property about this, do we have a little pointer? I left mine. No? Okay. Well, the additivity is the fact that you could extend these towers, which are meant to destroy, take the place of the Marais in Paris. You could extend them infinitely in any direction. All right? That is, you're looking at that technical problem, characteristic of additivity. Oh.
It's the red button on top.
The red button. Let's see. Brilliant. Thank you. How could a design school not have a pointer? So that's the additivity, is it could be 4, 8, whatever. And the what's called identity is that these towers are all the same. They don't vary. They are, the elements of design in it are absolute. Now, this is a very extreme example of closed form design because of this. I have to confess I find it very beautiful. You know? Very. But it's, it has those two fundamental properties of a closed system. And you can see in the hands of somebody who is not as gifted as Corb. These are public housing projects in Chicago. Chicago. They're added to forms by a student of Corbusier's, a Chicago student of Corbusier's. And just as an autobiographical interest, I grew up right there, so I know this very well. This is a housing project for mostly poor blacks. Here's a really interesting of closed form. This is a famous photo by Thomas Struth. It looks as though the towers have been varied, but basically their internal construction and the footprint is the same in every one of these forms. In other words, this is real skin architecture over a closed infrastructure, right? With just, there's no modulation from one of these buildings to the next inside. And that's also a way of thinking about a closed system, which is that whatever the skin is like, that the infrastructure is, it has that additive and identity uniformity thing. So, and here is why we hate this kind of thing. This is Ulsan, Korea. I'm sorry about, I went to photograph this with Thomas, and we just couldn't, we were on the top of a building like this, and we just had to get away. This is what all these repetitious towers are eating up. Ulsan used to be a craft center in South Korea, and there's a kind of relentless march of these towers. You understand why I bring this up. In other words, everybody complains about the uniformity and monotony of modern building, even people who build modern buildings. And there's a systematic, it's not just an architectural failure, there's a system that underlies it, which is closure, right? It's monotonous because it's closed. In the case of Corb, the objects are so beautiful that you don't, although it's monotonous, that's not your main reaction. But here, all you see is the monotony. Now, the next thing I want to show you is less familiar to you. And this is that in a closed system, there's a tight fit between form and function. Good, no? Form and function should be just like this, right? Wrong. That's a closed system that produces really disastrous results. And I'm going to show you. This is do you know what Masdar is? It's one of the smart cities. And okay, this is the docking station designed in Masdar for this automobile made by a friend of mine, Bill Mitchell, in conjunction with Frank Gehry. And it uses a kind of simplified maglev form of transport. And this is the Norman Foster office precisely engineering the stations to house these cars. Except that since these two were designed, these cars have evolved. They have become smaller. They have better magnets, all of which means that this station, Foster Station, has to be ripped out and something new put in its place. So what I want you to think about is that when you have a tight fit between form and function, you have technological obsolescence built in. If you don't have a loose fit, you can't adapt to evolution. And in the case of this beautiful little car that Bill did with Frank Gehry, it's evolved very quickly, whereas the infrastructure built for this tight join simply has to be ripped out. Now, I don't want to talk about capitalism tonight, but I just point out to you that this is the principle of selling lots of very expensive kit. technological kit to people. You make a tight fit between form and function. You have technological evolution, and lo and behold, you have to buy a new object, right? You know how this works in computers. I don't want to mention a company that starts with M and ends with T, but it's ubiquitous in the technical world. You know, it's a way of making technological obsolescence is a way of making capitalist profit. And that certainly would be the case here. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about as a phenomenon of closed system is static equilibrium. And here I'm going to show you something. This is, in a way, a static equilibrium. I have to be careful of this. I blind myself. This is Palmanova, and you know, this is so that it's a Renaissance design so that you can move artillery around anywhere in the plan. All the forms are sort of balanced in that way. One modern version of that, something unfamiliar to you, but very familiar in the Anglo-Saxon world, which is the Garden City movement, which was the attempt to create a whole city. These are socialists who did this, to attempt to create a city in which everything is in perfect balance with each other. They're the authors of the notion that equilibrium equals stability. And you can see how it, I don't know if you can see my slide very well. I'll give you a close-up of it. You can see what it is. Everything you see, every function is precisely allocated in the form. And the interesting thing about this is that this is not, it's not planning gone mad in the sense of uniformity. There's a huge division of labor, enormous thought went on to the size of the streets and so on. But everything is calibrated in terms of the whole. And I showed to you with Palmanova because radial plans like this tend to make this equation of absolute distribution. So this was a radical idea to say that sustainability equals equilibrium. You know, the capitalist city of the early 20th century was heaving. And these socialists, they're Fabian socialists, Patrick Geddes and his followers, say, no, a socialist, the idea of a socialist city is a city in which things balance, in which there's justice because things balance. The problem with this closed system is that if there's evolution in a part, then the whole thing goes out of whack. And enough of these cities have been built in Britain, the United States, South America, for us to know that these perfectly calibrated plans, everything goes out of whack if, for instance, there's no industry, light industry begins to predominate over heavy industry. Then the system is not as functional. If finance begins to play a larger role in relation to manufacturing, the system is not functional. So it contains the elements of its own disequilibrium in the search for a form of this sort, which is why we think about the search for equilibrium as a way of closing things off. Now, this is, you have to forgive me, I have to get some pleasure out of the lecture. I loathe the word context. I'm irrational on this subject. I don't believe in building in context. I believe in rupture. A familiar kind of context is evident in what's called new urbanism. They built one town in Seaside, Florida. And what happens here is that every building is in context of every other because they look the same. In other words, you achieve context by achieving homogeneity. And this is a familiar enemy. There's actually rather good urbanistics about walking on the street and so on here. But the architecture is a nightmare. This is an 18th century New England town at the edge of a swamp in Florida. You know, what really, here's another picture, it's horrible. What I think is more to the point for us about the horrors of context is a development by the Prince of Wales, funded by the Prince of Wales in England, called Poundbury. And it is an attempt to reconstruct a visual narrative of development in a place, to build it from scratch. Here are the things he built. It looks like time has unfolded slowly here. There's only one problem. All the interiors of these houses, just like the Tokyo skyscrapers I showed you, are absolutely the same. These are appliques producing a simulacrum of time. It's static. And to me, it's in, oops, we're not there yet. And what's offensive about it is that it suggests that the outside, the simulacrum, is really the content of a building, that the relationship between how it's built, how it functions, and how it looks is absolutely suspended. So here we have all of these 2-3 bedroom houses. They look so different, and they're absolutely the same, which is to say that the tyranny of context, as we know it in modern building, is to create difference as a kind of applique, as an ornament. Difference becomes ornament rather than the expression of how people have actually lived and what time actually looks like. The depressing thing about Poundbury is that it is the most popular housing development in Britain. There are waiting times of up to 2 years to buy a house here. And the reason for that is that it gives a sense of instant history, right? It's kind of a security blanket. You know that the houses are all modern, they're well heated, they've got internet connection, but the illusion of being secure historically is that when you step out of the house, this simulacrum takes over, and it looks as though you are rooted because the space is rooted. God, I'm talking much too much. Let me go quickly through the rest of it. So what would the qualities of an open system of design look like? I want you to make a jump from what I've presented so far, which is all in the developed world, to the developing world. It's a jump I've made my own thinking as an urbanist and where I work and what I teach about. Because I think that we have more chance with newly developed cities to do things right than trying to rewrite this kind of attitude. So I'm going to talk to you first about complexity in street forms, which is one aspect of the open system. This is Dharavi, which is a slum in Mumbai. Ever familiar to me because I got pleurisy there, which is, this all looks like disease to me. However, most of the Indians do not have pleurisy. And they find this multiplicity of functions, open, because where people live, where they work, where they eat, where they socialize, is all tight together. So the notion is that by bringing different functions close together, adjacent, that you stimulate a kind of life in the space. That's a design principle. Rather than separating these, they're brought close together. Whereas we, in the West, tend to take multiple functions as things that should be torn apart, separated in campuses. That's what this is all about, right? These are separated functions. Whereas the idea here is that you stimulate people, so horrible, let's never look at it again, by bringing differences adjacent to each other. And the idea of, this is the same street taken in another way, is that skill develops in navigating an open environment. I was showing you something quite extreme, and if it were my grandson involved in this, I would hate it, but it works in India. School for the people in this slum is here, which means that they have to traverse this railroad tracks to get to and from school. We're talking about 7 or 8-year-old kids. And as a result, they've studied train tables. They're very aware of this environment. They have to be, because they'd be killed if they weren't. They have become, and I've noticed this, I spent a lot of time here until I got really ill. They know everything about what's happening on the street, because, you know, this is a tough environment. So that there's what I would call a kind of grounded knowledge that develops out of complexity, which is inductive knowledge about what the nature of the environment is. You have to learn about your environment in order to survive in it. So as opposed to the smart city in which the functions are algorithmically laid out by somebody else, and you merely get into the car and the car drives you away, here you have much more actively to interrogate the environment you're in. Now, another thing about an environment like this is shifting. And I try to learn a little from that kind of shifting. This is a project I'm involved in, where each summer in a very poor housing estate in London, we fill the parking lots up with sand so that we have a beach for people who cannot afford to go to the beach. And then in the autumn, the sand is taken away. The idea about this is that once you believe that you should have a complex and shifting environment, that that's a good thing for people in terms of their cognition, it's something you can design. That is, that you begin to focus more on temporary and informal spaces rather than solid and fixed infrastructure. So for me, what I've learned from this, although it doesn't seem homologous, is that the shifting patterns that this kind of dense complexity gives rise to in the environment, and these shacks are constantly changing. There's a huge shack thing up here as well, a settlement. That these are shifts, we could adapt this to doing this kind of designing. This is an informal street. This is where drugs are sold every weekend in Johannesburg, along with fresh vegetables, so you can either buy your pot or your heroin or your cucumbers in here, and these trucks line up in rows, and they're temporary streets. And they serve very, very poor people. Well, the drugs part of it you probably wouldn't want, but it's an informal market in which the architecture is the cars, the lines of cars lined up. No architect, but there's architecture. There's an open architecture. Now, one thing I want to, in this regard, about formality and informality, is say that this is a continuum rather than an absolute contrast. This is in Bogota, and I'll tell you what these three floors represent. This bottom floor is just an open space in which people bring in cardboard boxes, in which magically they have goods which fell off the back of a truck, which a cousin told them about. In other words, stolen goods. And those stolen goods are sold here on tops of cardboard boxes, so the goods can, if the police ever came, which they're not brave enough to do, but were they ever to come, they would just put the goods in the box, and that would be the end of it. If you're really a good salesman here, you're a successful street dealer, complete informality, you can move up one flight in which you have protection from the police, but this is a more orderly environment. There's still boxes, but they're laid out in long lines as in any European street market. You can see what the competition is offering. It's much louder up here because people are hawking rather than saying, psst, have I got a cell phone for you? So the successful traders here tend to build up a clientele. And that clientele literally moves up with them to this first story. Among the most successful of these traders, still all dealing in stolen or what we call gray goods, are people up here who erect 4x8 sheets of cardboard or of plywood to make informal stores, so that rather than seeing what your competition is here, you go to visit your dealer in whatever. And what you've done is resolved an open form, which is completely informal, into a more formalized way of trading. You've gone, as it were, from outdoor, even though this is all inside, to indoor, to the shop. And that's a really important issue about design. We have to provide the kinds of spaces in our own much more advanced economy in which small and informal enterprises or activities can evolve into the more formal. So, it goes both ways, in other words. We want to deformalize certain kinds of structures, and we want to formalize or allow the possibility for evolutionary form to occur over time. I would say this is an urban design. It'll never be taught to you in an architecture school. But to me, this is what urban design is about, making it possible for this to happen by not interfering with zoning, by keeping the cops out. These people, by the way, begin to pay tax, which nobody down here does. So you could look at this also as a kind of birth of small business capitalism. But I'm saying, I think that the ability to recognize that this process is important is also urban design. So the first thing I've talked about is then the relationship between complexity, grounded knowledge, and informality. That's the first aspect of open system design to me. The second is the incomplete object. And this gets closer to home to all of us. If we design an object which is absolutely finished, done, the user has no share in it. They are the passive enactor of whatever function we've built into the object. In the housing field, the idea of the incomplete object is, do you know this design by Aravena? Yeah. By Ariki Aravena. And the idea of this is that he designed the DNA for these buildings, just this, and that as people they get richer, this costs $7,000 to buy one of these, that they begin to fill in the building and make a proper house, parts of which they can rent out. Usually they start living on the ground floor. As they fill up, they do this. This is all self-build. And the brilliance of this is that all the service stack is at the front, which means, usually when you do a fill-in, the location of the service stack in a party wall means that it's very difficult to do something like this. This is done by the people who live here, as they can afford bricks and mortar, and they just put in their own labor. So this is an incomplete object, okay, housing. And it's a way of really getting poor people building up a neighborhood. Is it linear or nonlinear? Look what these people have built. They've built a typical Spanish window. That's what they wanted. Like the citizens of Poundbury. What they want is a feeling of something recognizable, right? Something that's them, which is this colonial piece of Spanish architecture set in the midst of Aravena's very rather austere housing thing. So there are ways of resolving. That's also, I'd say it's nonlinear in that the architect himself never imagined this would happen and hates it. Furthermore, I think it's rather sweet, but I would say this is a nonlinear resolution. But it goes back to that issue we looked at before. And finally, I want to show you. So that's the incomplete object part of this. The third part of what I want to describe to you about open systems of design have to do with urban planning. And I've got a lot to say about this. I'm just going to show you one thing and then tell you the rest of it briefly. I'm really interested in replacing master planning by seed planning. And I'll explain to you what I mean by that. I have a friend who was until recently the mayor of Medellin, which, as you know, is one of the big drug, or was one of the big drug centers in Colombia, and then became a refuge place for people fleeing the civil war in the countryside. It's full of barrios like this, shacks, tin roofs, clean. I mean, these are people self-respecting, but in worst case than Mumbai. And my friend, Sergio Fajardo, decided that if he were going to deal with this with very limited resources, that he would do what we came up with as the idea of seed planting, which is to take a key civic function and build it in different ways in different parts of these enormous, this is a burial of more than 1.5 million people. So what he decided to do was, as you know, the huge wave of urbanization which is now occurring in the world is coterminous with the radical improvement in literacy. That is, people who are moving to cities are trying to educate themselves as well as their children in order to survive. So he hired a wonderful architect, Giorgio Marzanti. In this particular thing, these are actually, these three buildings are an architect, a school, there's a health service in here, and so on. And this is managed by the community. And the idea is that if you want to take people to take ownership over a place like a refugee camp, there's got to be things worth them taking ownership for. That is, that they have to have first-class architecture, which gives them a sense of dignity and of pride in their community. So he put his money not into sewage, but into libraries. And the idea, when he argued this to the bourgeoisie of Medellin, was no more opera houses. We want starchitects to build for the poor. And he's done just that. The seed planting is that every library he's built by a different architect, had commissioned, functions in a different way. This doesn't have a medical center in it, but it has a space for elderly people. This is a downtown library. Behind this is another enormous slum. These are run locally. The differences in the architecture come out not because they're different architects only, but because the architects are working with different community groups and arriving at different solutions. So the idea of this is that you gradually, rather than trying to plan overall the way the Garden City was planned, that you put in a critical infrastructure and you make it different. That's the open systems thing about this. You may have the same function, but you have a different form. Understand what I mean? They're all libraries, all three of these. Oops. They're all libraries. They all serve the same purpose, but they're not the same. And that's part of taking ownership over something which is distinctive. So this seed planning is a way of dealing with questions of scale in urban design, beyond the question of the incomplete object, of scale, without working towards that kind of uniformity. I'll just show you, just because it's so beautiful. This is my friend David Adjai built. This is the same thing he's done in London, poor parts of London. This is a library for Muslim library users, and this is a library for largely Jamaican and Afro-Caribbean users. It has a different form because he consulted with the community in different ways. He's going to build about 12 of these. Again, it doesn't create a coherent city, you know? But it creates something, it has a form, is providing a function which breaks this tight divide. Now, I should say finally about this, since we're going to talk, I'll just end by saying the other part of the planning, urban planning thing in an open system, is using the principle of assemblage rather than the idea of a collage. And what I mean by that is that an assemblage is the putting together of two elements that when they're adjacent to each other begin to interact. This is an assemblage. Let's go. Oops. This is an assemblage. That is the transport function, the school, this main street, are next to each other and they're interacting. The principle of an assemblage is that choosing which elements will interact with each other. Whereas in a collage, the notion of that interaction is rather different. By collage, I don't mean what you're thinking about, Juan Gris. I'm thinking about, for instance, graffiti sprayed on a wall, where one graffiti artist will just spray over somebody else's work. And that's, that's collage. You don't care what's there before, you just sign, and that's you. That same principle of collage is the way in which we tend to build big forms in the city today. We put a shopping center next to a park, or a shopping center next to a highway, without thinking about whether these forms are going to interact. Gated community is the ultimate example of that. You can have a city which is a collage of gated communities. My notion is that rather, and it's not unique to me, it's Bruno Latour and Saskia Sassen have written about this as well, is that what we need to think about large-scale forms as is assemblage rather than collage. And in urban design, that means how do the parts of things which are chaotic stimulate each other? How do we get more, not chaotic, but how do the parts of things which may be closed stimulate each other to open each other up? I'll give you an example. I built some AIDS clinics in shopping centers in suburban New York. Incredibly different function, shopping or dying. Most AIDS sufferers don't look very good, particularly those who have Kaposi's sarcoma. And the effect of putting these AIDS hospices in these shopping centers was actually to make what was a monofunctional place into the beginnings of actually an inhabitable human place, where there was complexity, difference, where people expected the parts of the AIDS people too, because they wanted to hide, not show themselves, because particularly the ones with Kaposi's sarcoma, because they look horrible. The notion about being exposed. This went all ways. And that's the beginning, I think, of when you make a living city. So, in sum, I've talked to you about three things tonight. I've talked to you about the formal properties of closed and open systems. I've showed you some examples, and there are no more than that, of what closed and open design looks like. And I've concluded by saying that we get scale in this through the principles of seeding the same function in different forms, and through following the logic of assemblage rather than collage. So if I live long enough, this is what my book is going to be about. And I'd love to get comments from you on this. I'm in the middle of writing this, so criticism, not too strong, but helpful criticism would be very much appreciated. Thank you for your time.